The wagons were already moving when she came out of the grass. She had been gone 11 minutes. She would count it later, precisely, the way she counted everything that mattered. Gone to the creek bed 60 yards off the trail, because the creek was the only privacy the prairie offered, and a woman required privacy sometimes regardless of what the wagon master's schedule demanded. 11 minutes. She came back through the tall grass with her skirt still damp at the hem, and she could see the dust rising ahead of the last wagon, and she could see, without any question, that the last wagon was not stopping. She ran. She was not a woman built for running, and she knew it, and she ran anyway, her trunk still roped to the tailgate of the Hennessy wagon 30 yards ahead, her traveling bag over her shoulder, calling out, once, twice, until her voice reached them and she saw Mrs. Hennessy's face turn back from the wagon seat and saw the woman's expression, which was not surprise. Not surprise. She stopped running. Behind her, still standing at the creek path, was the cowboy. If what just happened to this woman stopped your breath, subscribe to this channel right now and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. Because what Ruth Crane did not know yet, standing in the Nebraska grass watching the wagon train go without her, is that the man who stayed behind had made his choice 3 days ago. He had simply been waiting for his moment to act on it. Stay with me. Her name was Ruth Ellery Crane, and she had been traveling for 22 days. One train from Columbus to St. Joseph. One hired coach to the staging grounds at Kearney. Then the wagon train northwest from Kearney toward the Wyoming Territory, where her brother Daniel had filed a homestead claim on 160 acres of grassland the previous spring, and was building a house he had written her about in letters that grew more optimistic as the lumber grew scarcer. She was 34 years old. She had been a school teacher in Columbus for 9 years, and she had kept the school through 2 principals who underestimated her, and one flood that took the schoolroom floor in April of 1875, and which she had addressed by moving her class of 14 children to her own parlor for 6 weeks, a decision that the school board had not sanctioned, and that she had not asked them to sanction. Because she had learned early that asking permission for necessary things was slower than doing them and apologizing afterward. She had sold the parlor furniture to pay for the wagon train passage. She had kept the books. She was a large woman, broad-shouldered, full-figured, with the particular solidity of someone who had spent years standing in front of rooms full of children and had developed the posture that position required, the kind of presence that filled a space intentionally. She had never been a small woman and had not wasted a morning of her 34 years wishing otherwise. The wagon master's name was Greer. He had told her at the staging grounds in Kearney, when she had presented herself with her trunk and her traveling bag and her paid passage receipt, that the trail was hard country and harder on some than others, and he had looked at her in the way of a man performing an assessment and finding the numbers unsatisfactory. She had looked at her receipt and handed it to him and said nothing, because the receipt said what needed saying. She had heard what he told his outriders on the second evening, when he thought she was asleep in the Hennessy wagon. She had not been asleep. She had been lying still in the dark with her eyes open, which was not the same thing. And she had heard her name, and she had heard the word liability, and she had heard the logic of it, that the train was behind schedule from the rains, that the Hennessy wagon was already slow, that there were decisions a wagon master had to make about weight and pace and what the trail demanded. She had lain still for 3 minutes after she heard it. Then she had turned over and gone to sleep, because lying awake with other people's opinions of her was a luxury she had given up at 22. The cowboy's name was Cade Lowe. He had been riding scout for the Greer train since Kearney, a hired position, point rider, which meant he ranged ahead of the wagons and came back with information about water and weather and the general temper of the trail. He was 31 years old, and he had been doing this work for 4 years, since a thing had happened in Texas that he did not talk about, but that had left him with a specific and private understanding of what it cost a man to watch an injustice and ride past it. He had been paying that account for 4 years, and he had not yet found the bottom of it. He had noticed Ruth Crane on the 4th day, not in the way men noticed women, or not only in that way, but in the way a man notices someone who is doing a harder version of the same journey as everyone else and is not making anything of it. She had helped the Hennessy children with their letters every evening after the camp was made, using a smooth board and a piece of charcoal, and she had fixed the Hennessy wagon's wheel box packing on the 9th day when it had started to work loose, a job the Hennessy husband had declared beyond remedy, and she had done both of these things without comment or credit, and had gone about her business. He had been watching Greer for 3 days by the time they reached the creek crossing. He had known something was coming. He had not known it would come this way. She did not speak when he reached her. He came up beside her, and they stood together in the Nebraska grass and watched the dust of the wagon train moving northwest and getting smaller, and there was nothing to say that the situation had not already said. So neither of them said it. The last wagon rounded the long slope and dropped below the sight line, and the dust thinned behind it, and then there was only the grass and the wind and the sound of the creek 40 yards south, and the sky overhead doing what the Wyoming sky did, spreading itself flat and enormous in every direction, indifferent to everything happening beneath it. Ruth set her traveling bag down in the grass. She stood with her hands at her sides. "My trunk's on the Hennessy wagon," she said. "I know," he said. "My money was in my coat pocket," she said. "I have it." "That's something," he said. She looked at the horizon where the dust had been. 37 seconds. She gave herself 37 seconds to stand there and feel what this was. The full weight of it, the specific humiliation of being calculated against and found insufficient, the particular cold of watching the thing you were traveling toward continue without you. 37 seconds, and then she picked up her traveling bag. "Water at the creek," she said. "Is there shelter within a reasonable distance?" He had been watching her for those 37 seconds the way he watched everything on the trail, carefully, learning what he needed to know. What he needed to know, he had learned. "Abandoned dugout," he said, 2 miles east. "I scouted it 4 days ago." "Show me," she said. He showed her. The dugout was half into a low cut bank, roofed with sod that it held better than it had any right to, with a door frame but no door, and a floor of packed earth that was dry and level. It was 8 feet by 10 feet, and it smelled of old smoke and animal use, but it was structurally sound, which was what mattered. Ruth stood in the entrance and looked at it the way she looked at problems, not with the question of whether it was adequate, but with the question of what it would take to make it adequate. "How far to the next settlement?" she said. "Fort Laramie," he said. 110 miles northwest. There's a trading post at Ash Hollow, maybe 40 miles north. 40 miles, she said. 2 days hard riding, 3 on foot. She looked at her traveling bag. She had 2 dresses, a wool blanket, needle and thread, a tin cup, a small knife her brother had sent her for the journey, a book of Ohio land statutes she had brought to read on the train and had read twice, a wedge of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, and 4 hardtack biscuits. She set the bag inside the dugout. "Your horse is provisioned for 3 days," she said. It was not a question. 4, if we're careful, he said. "You should ride for Ash Hollow," she said. "Get provisions and come back, or send someone. I'll stay here." He looked at her. "I'm not going to walk 110 miles to Fort Laramie," she said. "And you have a horse. It's the sensible arrangement. I'm not leaving you alone in a dugout in Nebraska," he said. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who has spent 9 years managing other people's children and has become very precise about which arguments were worth having and which were not. "How long for the round trip?" she said. 4 days, he said. "Maybe 5. Then we share the provisions for 2 days, she said. And you ride on the 3rd morning, and I manage until you return. I'm not incapable of 4 days in a dugout." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you are." He did not leave on the 3rd morning. He would explain this later, in the way he explained most things, briefly, with no decoration, by saying that the arrangement had seemed less sensible the longer he considered it. What he did not say, because it was not the kind of thing he said, was that by the 2nd evening at the dugout he had begun to understand that 4 days apart from Ruth Crane was a cost he was not prepared to pay. They built a camp rather than merely using the dugout. This was Ruth's determination on the 1st morning, not because their circumstances permitted excess, but because she had learned in 9 years of teaching that a person's ability to sustain effort over time was directly connected to whether they felt they were maintaining dignity or merely surviving, and she intended to maintain dignity. She hung her spare dress across the doorframe, and that was a curtain. She sorted the dugout floor with a small knife and a flat stone until it was level. She found clay along the creek bank and plugged 3 gaps in the sod roof before afternoon, a task that Cade watched from outside and then joined without being asked, the two of them working from opposite ends until the work was done. On the 2nd day, she found the wild onion growing in a seam along the cut bank, and she found the prairie turnip 50 yards north, and she told him where to look for the creek's crayfish, which he had not thought to look for, and that evening she made a broth from all of it over the small fire. Not enough, not what either of them needed, but hot and savory and smelling of something intentional. And Cade drank his cup in the way she had come to recognize as his version of a compliment, slowly, as if he wanted it to last. "Where'd you learn that?" he said. "Books," she said. "And necessity. They teach the same things by different routes." He looked at the fire. "You were a school teacher. 9 years. What did you teach?" "Whatever they needed," she said. "Reading. Figures, once for 6 weeks, remedial carpentry, because the schoolroom floor was out and I had 14 children and no classroom." She paused. "They learned to fit a plank before they learned long division. I maintain it did them no harm." He looked at her with the expression she was learning to read, the one that arrived when she had said something that reached past his guard before he had time to close it. He looked at the fire instead. "Texas," he said, after a while. The way he said it told her it was not a non sequitur. She waited. 4 years ago," he said. "I was working a cattle drive. There was a family at a creek crossing, homesteaders, a woman and 2 boys. Husband was dead. Flash flood had taken their wagon and most of what was in it. They needed help." He put his cup down. "The trail boss said we were behind schedule, said it wasn't our concern." He was quiet for a moment. I rode past. Ruth said nothing. "I've been thinking about that woman every day for 4 years," he said, "whether she made it, whether the boys did." He looked at his hands, "Whether I would do it different." "Would you?" she said. He looked up. He looked at her, directly, without the guard up. "That's why I'm here," he said. She held that for a moment. "I know," she said. It was not the reason she wanted him to be there. She was honest enough with herself to know that. But it was a true reason, and a good one, and it was enough for now, which was all now ever asked. He did not say anything else. She did not say anything else. Outside, the Nebraska dark spread itself over the grassland from horizon to horizon, deeper than any dark she had known in Ohio, full of the sounds of things that lived in it and moved in it and had no concern at all for the two people in the dugout below. She was not afraid. She was, when she examined it carefully, the least afraid she had been in a very long time. Greer came back on the 9th day. He was not coming back for her. She understood that without being told. He was coming back because one of his outriders had reported a missing scout. Cade had been off the roster for 9 days, and someone had finally calculated what that meant. And Greer had turned a portion of his train south and east to look, because a missing scout was a liability of a different kind. A man whose absence could be reported and traced, and that had legal standing that a woman left behind at a creek crossing did not. She heard the horses before she saw them. She was at the creek bank with the flat stone, washing the tin cup, and she heard the hoofbeats from the northwest, and she straightened, and she looked. Greer came over the low rise with 4 riders behind him, and he pulled up when he saw the dugout, and when he saw the fire ring, and the clay-patched sod roof and the dress hung across the doorframe, and he sat his horse, and his expression moved through several revisions before it settled. Cade came out of the dugout. He stood in the entrance and looked at Greer for a long moment, and said nothing. Behind Greer, the 4 riders were doing the quiet recalibration of men who had ridden out expecting to find a body. Greer looked at Ruth, who had come up from the creek and was standing 15 feet from the dugout with a tin cup in her hand and the particular expression of a woman who has had 9 days to decide exactly what she will say when this moment comes, and who has decided she will say nothing because there is nothing to say that the situation does not say better. "Lo," Greer said. "Greer," Cade said. "You abandoned your post." "I did," Cade said. He said it the way a man says something he does not intend to revisit. "You abandoned a passenger. I figured we were even." Greer's jaw moved. "The train needed, I know what the train needed," Cade said. He came down from the dugout entrance and walked toward Greer's horse and stopped 6 feet short of it, which was a specific and deliberate distance. The distance of a man who is speaking plainly and wants the plainness to land without the proximity becoming something else. She had paid passage. You left her at a creek crossing in Nebraska with 9 days of trail left and no horse, and no one who'd stayed behind to know it. One of the 4 riders behind Greer shifted in his saddle. She noted it. "She held up the train," Greer said. "She was. She chinked the sod roof of a dugout with creek clay," Cade said. "She found food in open grassland where I hadn't thought to look. She made a camp out of nothing for 9 days, and every part of it is still standing." He paused. "You tell me what you thought you were leaving behind." The 4 riders were looking at the dugout, at the clay seams in the sod, at the fire ring built properly with the windbreak on the north side, at Ruth, who was still standing with the tin cup, and who was looking at Greer with an expression that was not anger and was not satisfaction. It was the expression of a woman who has known her own worth for 34 years and is accustomed to being the only one in the room who knows it, and who is watching the room catch up. Greer looked at her. He looked at the dugout. He looked at Cade. There was a very long pause. 11 seconds, she counted. And in those 11 seconds, something moved across his face that was not quite shame and was not quite respect, and was somewhere between the two, in the territory a man occupies when he has made a calculation and been shown the error in it by the evidence of the calculation itself. "The Hennessy wagon has your trunk," he said. He said it to Ruth, not to Cade. "I know," she said. "We're a day and a half north," he said. "If you want it, we'll ride north in the morning," Cade said. He did not look at Ruth when he said we. He did not need to. Greer looked at him for a moment. Then he turned his horse, and the 4 riders turned with him, and they rode back north, and the sound of them faded into the grass, and the dugout stood in the late afternoon light with its clay-patched sod, and its dress-curtained door, and its fire ring built right. And it was, Ruth Crane thought, the thing she had built with the least she had ever had, and the one she was most certain of. She looked at Cade. He was looking at the horizon where Greer had gone. "We," she said. He turned. "You said we," she said. He looked at her with the expression she had catalogued on the fourth day and had been revisiting since. The one without the guard up, the one that did not perform anything. "Yes," he said. "I did." She looked at the sky, at the grassland, at the 9 days of work visible in every surface of the camp around them. She thought about Daniel's homestead in Wyoming, with the house getting built out of scarcer and scarcer lumber, and about the 160 acres that needed someone to work them, and about the particular freedom of a woman who had sold her furniture and was going west anyway. "My brother's homestead is going to need more than one pair of hands," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I expect it will," he said. She picked up the flat stone from where she had set it beside the fire ring and put it back at the creek bank where it belonged, because she was a woman who left things as she had found them when she was finished with them, and she was finished with the creek. "We should sleep," she said. "We have a day and a half north in the morning." He said nothing, but he fed the fire before he turned in, banking it carefully. The way you bank a fire when you intend the warmth to last through the night, not perfunctorily, not minimally, but with the specific attention of a man who has decided that what is on the other side of the fire is worth tending for. She lay in the dugout in the dark and listened to the Nebraska grassland, and she thought about 37 seconds at a creek bank, and about 9 days, and about the particular word we said without looking at her, as if it were simply the obvious word, the correct word, the only word that fit. She did not need to examine it further. Some things required no further examination. She was asleep before the fire burned low. They reached the Hennessy wagon the next afternoon, and Mrs. Hennessy came down from the seat before the wagon had fully stopped, and she put her arms around Ruth without speaking, which told Ruth everything she needed to know about what had passed in the Hennessy wagon over 9 days, and what Mrs. Hennessy had said to her husband about it, and who had been right. The trunk was there. Undisturbed, Mrs. Hennessy had kept a hand on it. Greer did not approach Ruth directly. He rode wide of the reunion and busied himself with the trail order and did not look at her, which was, she decided, a sufficient accounting. Not every man was built to say the thing he ought to say. What mattered was whether he showed up to say something, and he had shown up. She retrieved her trunk. She tied it to Cade's pack horse, which was now her pack horse also, which neither of them had discussed, and both of them understood. 3 weeks later, at a settlement 50 miles from Daniel's homestead, they were married by a circuit preacher who had the cheerful efficiency of a man who had conducted ceremonies in every condition the frontier offered, and who said the words the same way whether he was standing in a parlor or in open grassland, because the words were the same either way. Ruth said hers, without looking down. Cade said his in 6 words where 10 were provided, which she had already learned was simply his way, and which she had already learned to read as fluency in a language that did not waste syllables. Daniel shook Cade's hand at the homestead and looked at his sister and said, "You were supposed to arrive with the wagon train in August. It was the end of September." She said, "I took the more instructive route." And that was the only explanation she offered, and the only one she was ever asked to give. She learned the Wyoming homestead the way she had learned the dugout, practically, completely, without sentimentality about what it was not, and with full attention to what it was. There was a kitchen that needed work, and a field that needed turning, and a house that needed the lumber her brother had been promising, and she addressed each of these things in the order they presented themselves, and she did not ask permission to address them. 14 years later, in the autumn of 1892, Ruth and Cade's daughter Clara left for the normal school in Laramie, the first girl from that Homestead Valley to go, and on the morning she left, her mother stood in the yard and watched the wagon take her down the track, and she stood there until the wagon was past the ridgeline, and then she went back inside and made breakfast, and did not make anything of it, because Clara was going because she was capable, and going was what capable people did when they had somewhere to go. There was a letter waiting on the kitchen table that afternoon. Clara had left it there before dawn. It said, "Mama, I learned everything from you. I am not afraid." See, Ruth read it once. She set it on the shelf above the stove where she kept the things that mattered. Then she went back to work, the way she had always gone back to work. Because there was always more to do, and she was the kind of woman who did it, and the kind of woman who had always known, before the wagon train, and before Nebraska, and before the 9 days, and before any of it, that she was exactly sufficient for whatever the world set down in front of her. She had never needed a wagon master's permission to believe that. She had never needed anyone's.